The art of war. Just hearing those words, it conjures images of, well, clashing armies, grand battles, strategic maneuvers on some field of conflict.
Right. Massive campaigns.
Exactly. But what if the most profound text ever written on warfare wasn't really about fighting at all? What if its core message was actually about winning before the battle even begins? About a kind of strategy that makes conflict unnecessary.
That's the paradox, isn't it? Right at the heart of Sun Tzu's The Art of War, a text that's, what, over 2,000 years old?
At least. And it still shapes how we think about conflict, about competition, about strategy today. It's really quite remarkable.
And it's definitely not just military strategy anymore. I mean, its principles are used all the time in boardrooms and legal negotiations, sports rivalries.
Oh, absolutely.
Even just navigating tricky personal dynamics sometimes. It's become a kind of guide to effective action, really, in almost any competitive situation.
Precisely. So for this deep dive, we've gathered, well, quite a stack of sources. Ancient commentaries, modern analyses, historical accounts, academic papers, the whole lot. We want to really understand what makes the art of war so incredibly enduring.
And our mission, for you listening, is to try and cut through some of the noise, maybe extract the most important insights, and offer a kind of strategic analysis tailored for your own thinking.
To really get a grip on these ideas, though, we probably need to anchor them in their origin first, right? Where did this come from?
Definitely. Sun Tzu's work, traditionally, it's set against the backdrop of China's warring states, period. We're talking roughly the 3rd century BC, maybe even a bit earlier in parts.
And this wasn't just a time of, occasional skirmishes.
No, not at all. This was an era of almost constant existential conflict. You had numerous rival states all vying for dominance, fighting for survival.
So think of it like a pressure cooker, maybe. A forge, where only the absolute sharpest strategic thinking could ensure you actually survived.
Exactly. The stakes were incredibly high. The very existence of entire states, millions of lives. It was brutal. And this crucible, this environment, is where the ideas and the art of war were really honed.
Okay. So throughout this deep dive, we'll be your guides. We'll explore the core philosophy, the layered strategic thinking, and maybe some surprising insights, too, all drawn directly from the material we've got here.
Let's jump right in, then.
All right. So let's start with maybe the most surprising aspect of the art of war. Its very foundation. Yes, it's about warfare, but it seems profoundly about more than just fighting.
That's absolutely the critical starting point. Sun Tzu doesn't treat warfare lightly at all. He states right up front, it's of vital importance to the state, a matter of life and death, the road to either safety or ruin.
So not a secondary concern.
Not even close. It's essential for national survival, and he says it absolutely cannot be neglected under any circumstances. There's a real urgency there.
And this urgency, it sets the stage for that counterintuitive core principle you mentioned earlier. The main emphasis is actually on avoiding conflict if possible.
Right. Winning isn't necessarily achieved through bloody battles. It's achieved by being so strategically sound, so well prepared, that you secure your nation and keep your armed forces whole, ideally without fighting at all. The absolute pinnacle of skill, he says, is winning without a single clash.
Wow. That leads to that really powerful, almost paradoxical statement early on. A victorious army first wins and then seeks battle. What does that actually mean in practice?
It means they've essentially already secured the victory before they commit troops. How? Through meticulous planning, superior positioning, creating an overwhelming advantage. The strategic work is done beforehand.
Okay, so they've engineered the situation to make the outcome almost certain.
Exactly. Which is the complete opposite, Sun Tzu says, of a defeated army. They battle first and then they desperately seek victory. They're just throwing themselves into the fight, hoping things work out.
That really highlights the priority of forethought, of strategy, over just reactive force, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And tied right into this from the very beginning is the fundamental role of deception.
Ah, deception.
Sun Tzu states it directly. Warfare is the Tao, the way of deception. It's not just an optional tactic. It's inherent to the whole enterprise.
Okay, so moving past that initial sort of philosophical frame, Sun Tzu gives us the bedrock for all the strategic calculation that follows. He identifies 5 fundamental factors, right? The 5 constant factors.
Yes, and any commander, any strategist has to meticulously weigh these. They form the basis of what he calls the initial estimations.
Let's break those down. What are they?
All right. They cover everything from, well, morale to meteorology, really. First is the moral law.
Moral law.
It refers to the harmony, the unity between the ruler and the people. It's about achieving a state of morale where the populace is so aligned with their leader's purpose, so trusting, that they'll follow him even to their death, without fear or doubt.
It's a very high standard.
It is. Second is heaven. This covers the natural environment and temporal conditions, night and day, cold and heat, times and seasons. It's about understanding and factoring in the weather, the climate, the time of year, even the time of day when you're planning operations.
Makes sense. Weather matters.
Immensely. Third is Earth. This is the terrain itself.
Physical landscape.
Exactly. Distances, great or small, danger versus security, open ground versus narrow passes, the inherent chances of life and death the landscape presents, geography, topography, how it impacts movement, positioning, all of it.
Okay. Fourth.
Fourth is the commander. This focuses squarely on the leader's essential qualities, things like intelligence, trustworthiness, humaneness or benevolence, courage, and sternness.
So the character and capability of the person in charge are seen as fundamental strategic factors themselves.
Absolutely fundamental. And fifth, finally, is method and discipline.
Right, the organizational side.
Precisely. How the army is marshaled into its proper subdivisions, the clear structure of ranks among officers, maintaining supply lines and roads, controlling military spending. It's the nuts and bolts of organization, logistics, and the command structure.
And Sun Tzu insists that you have to deliberate on these 5 factors constantly.
Critically, by thoroughly analyzing and weighing these constants, a commander can understand the conditions in the field, make informed decisions, and lay the essential groundwork for any effective strategy. It's non-negotiable.
Okay. Beyond these foundational factors, the sources also highlight a really critical Chinese military concept, something central to Sun Tzu's thinking. Shi.
Yes, shi. It doesn't really have a perfect one-to-one English translation.
No, it seems tricky.
It is, but you can think of it as the strategic configuration of power, or maybe the potential energy that's inherent in a given situation.
Potential energy, like physics.
Sort of. It's about creating a situation, shaping the circumstances so they are naturally set up for victory. Sun Tzu puts it beautifully, seeking victory through shi, not from reliance upon men.
So it's not devaluing the soldiers.
Not at all. But it emphasizes that the commander's real skill lies in manipulating the situation, the shi, so that success flows almost naturally from the force of circumstances. It's not just depending on the individual bravery of troops fighting against the odds.
Got it. It's stacking the deck beforehand.
In a way, yes. And Sun, who we'll talk more about, a descendant and a noted strategist himself, he characterized shi very vividly. He called it the means by which to cause the soldiers to inevitably fight.
Inevitably fight.
Yeah. It's arranging things so that advancing feels not just possible, but almost compelled by the obvious advantages you've created. The soldiers' actions become almost automatic responses to a favorable strategic landscape.
And the sources mention that when there's this clear imbalance in strategic power, in the shi, winning is easy.
Right. Soldiers are naturally motivated when they see clear advantages laid out before them. Conversely, if those advantages are absent, if the shin's against them, soldiers might genuinely prefer punishment or even death rather than just uselessly advancing into a situation that's obviously unwinnable.
So the commander's main job is really to build and exploit this favorable shin.
That's a huge part of it. And it's fascinating how pragmatic the art of war is, laser focused on strategic outcomes. But it's not just some standalone tactical manual. The source is really strongly connected to the broader philosophical currents of the warring states period, particularly Taoism.
Okay, this is interesting. How does Taoism fit in?
This is where some of the deeper, maybe less obvious insights come from. The text is seen as really deeply permeated with ideas from classic Taoist texts like the Ji I Ching and the Tao Te Ching. Taoism offers insights into, human nature and the kind of psychological development needed to really grasp strategy at its deepest levels.
Like the art of invisibility, the sources mention, knowing everything about your opponent while remaining unknown yourself.
Exactly. That's linked to the kind of internal detachment that Taoists cultivated. This detachment allows for an impersonal, objective view of reality, crucial for strategic clarity, freeing you from emotional bias.
And maybe this Taoist thread helps explain that seeming paradox we started with, the idea of a text on warfare advocating avoiding conflict.
It could well do. It suggests it's not just about being, Nice. It's a cold, strategic calculation rooted in a Taoist understanding of the flow of events, the consequences of unnecessary action, the conservation of energy.
Minimalism and strategy, maybe.
Precisely. That principle echoes Taoist thought, too. The I Ching, for example, warns against prolonging conflict, especially if you're in a weak position. And the Art of War mirrors this directly, warning that prolonged battles inevitably exhaust your forces, your resources, and just invite disaster.
It's useful, too, to briefly touch on other schools of thought around at the same time, just for context, even if they had different views. Mohism, for instance.
Right. Mohism emphasized impartial care for everyone and actively opposed aggressive warfare. They favored defensive strategies and used objective standards, called Fa, focused on utility and what was actually beneficial.
And legalism.
Legalism was intensely pragmatic too, but focused much more on state power, administrative techniques, and using strict rule by law to strengthen the state above all else.
So Sun Tzu's specific focus on strategic success in conflict, it differs from Mohism's kind of universal ethics, or legalism's focus on state control mechanism.
Definitely. But these ideas were all swirling around in that same intellectual environment, influencing how people thought about governance, order, and conflict. The Art of War stands out as this unique synthesis, focusing almost purely on the principles governing the dynamics of strategic engagement itself.
Okay, let's dig into the more practical application of these foundational ideas then, especially in those crucial initial stages of calculation and planning. Chapters 1 to 3 seem key here, starting with laying plans.
Absolutely. Chapter 1, Laying Plans. It circles right back to that core idea we discussed. Meticulous planning and assessment must happen before you even think about moving troops or engaging.
The sources, quote, the commentator Jia Kung, defining this as the vital deliberations happening inside the general's tent.
Exactly. Where the entire operation is thought through, weighed, calculated, it reinforces that a winning strategy isn't usually found on the battlefield. It's determined before the troops are even sent out.
So relying just on your strength, your numbers, without that deep planning.
Leads to uncertain victory at best, and more often than not, self-defeat. You're just leaving everything to the chaos of combat instead of controlling the narrative beforehand.
Then, Chapter 2, Waging War, gets very real very quickly about the economics.
Oh, immediately. It confronts the harsh economic reality. War is ruinously expensive. The sources give that vivid example. 1,000 ounces of silver per day just to maintain a 100,000-man army with distant supply lines.
That's staggering. Enough to cripple a state.
Easily. And this focus on cost hammers home the absolute need for speed and efficient resource management. Prolonged fighting isn't just militarily risky, it has all these cascading negative effects.
Like what?
Well, it dulls your weapons, it exhausts the soldier's spirit, he calls it damping ardor, it drains physical strength, it spends the state's treasure, and crucially, it broadcasts your weakness to others, inviting them to jump in and attack you while you're bogged down.
The sources are pretty blunt. Cleverness has never been seen associated with long delays.
Exactly. Strike quickly and decisively, or perhaps don't strike at all if the costs and duration look too high. And the impact on the civilian population from the logistics.
Yeah, the transport costs.
Brutal.
Yeah.
Transporting provisions over long distances is crippling. Master Guan is cited describing that escalating cost. 300 miles means losing a year's worth of supplies in transit. 400 miles means 2 years' worth lost. 500 miles leaves the people starving.
So the clear takeaway is, forage from the enemy if you can, or avoid operations that need those incredibly long supply lines.
Right. Which brings us neatly to Chapter 3, Attack by Stratagem. This presents Sun Tzu's ideal scenario.
Which is?
Conquering the enemy without battle, without a single sword being drawn. That, he says, is the absolute pinnacle of skill. Why incur all the costs, the risks, the casualties of direct combat if you can achieve your objective through superior strategy and manipulation?
So how do you do that? He lays out a hierarchy, doesn't he?
He does. A very clear, prioritized hierarchy of attack, moving from the least costly and risky options to the most desperate. The absolute best strategy. Attack the enemy's plans first, disrupt their strategy before they can even start.
Foil them before they move.
Exactly. Second best, attack their alliances, isolate them politically, diplomatically, cut off their support structure.
Makes sense. Third.
Third, if you must, is attacking their army in the field. Direct confrontation.
And the worst option.
The lowest, most costly, least desirable option is sieging walled cities. It just consumes immense time, resources, and lives, often for little strategic gain compared to the cost.
This whole hierarchy, it fundamentally prioritizes intelligence gathering, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You have to know the conditions of opponents to attack their plans or break their alliances.
Absolutely. And, of course, leveraging deception. As we established, warfare is the Tao of deception. It's woven through all of this.
The sources list a whole range of practical strategies for this, right? For achieving that bloodless or low-cost victory.
Yeah, quite a few. Things like appearing capable when you're secretly incapable, or presenting yourself as active when you're really inactive, making the enemy think you're near when you're distant, and distant when you're near.
Classic misdirection.
Classic. Entice the enemy with the prospect of profit to lure them into a trap. Create disorder and division within their ranks. Avoid their strong points, target their weaknesses, provoke the easily angered general into rash action. Exploit arrogance in the deferential leader. Force their rested troops to wear themselves out chasing phantoms. Find ways to separate their united forces so you can pick them off piece by piece.
The core idea seems to be attack where they are completely unprepared and move to places they absolutely do not expect you.
That's it. These methods, Sun Tzu says, are how victorious strategists operate.
There's also that tactic mentioned, attacking the enemy's must-save point.
Yes, that's a particularly sharp one. Find a location so vital to them, their capital, a key supply depot, maybe even their families, that attacking it guarantees they'll be compelled to divert forces from wherever they are currently, rushing to its defense. And that often creates a vulnerability elsewhere that you can then exploit.
The Battle of Kuiling example from the sources illustrates this perfectly, doesn't it?
It really does. So the state of Wei is besieging the capital of Chao. The state of Qi comes to help Chao, led by the strategist Sun Pin.
Sun Tzu's descendant.
Right. Now, instead of marching straight to Chao to fight Wei's main army head-on, Sun Pin advises attacking Wei's own capital, Dalian. Why?
Because Wei's best troops were tied up at the siege in Chao, leaving their capital vulnerable.
Exactly. Striking their newly vacuous points, as the text puts it. Wei had no choice. They were forced to abandon their siege of Handan and race back to defend their own capital.
And they ran right into Qi's ambush at Kuiling.
And were decisively defeated. It shows exactly how attacking a point of weakness, a must-save point, can compel the enemy to move in a way that leads directly to their destruction, without Qi ever having to face Wei's full strength where Wei was strongest. You win by manipulating their movement.
There was another smaller anecdote, too, about a Wu general.
Yes. He attacked a city. The enemy had reinforcements coming down the road to relieve the city. But when those reinforcements heard the city was already under attack, they simply withdrew.
They didn't even fight.
No. The Wu general won and was rewarded not for defeating the reinforcements in battle, but because his strategic action attacking the city disrupted the enemy's larger plan and manipulated their movement without needing a direct fight with that supporting force. It shows how one calculated move can unravel the enemy's whole posture.
These examples really drive home how tactical actions, when driven by sharp strategic insight into the enemy's situation and their likely reactions, can achieve major objectives with minimal actual fighting.
It's all about that calculation beforehand.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly now to deception and adaptability. These seem absolutely crucial for actually implementing the strategies we've just talked about.
Yep.
Chapters 4 through 6 look key here.
They are vital. Chapter 4, Tactical Dispositions, really emphasizes securing your own position first. The core idea is make yourself invincible before you even think about attacking. Defensive strength is paramount.
So build an unshakable foundation.
Exactly. As the sources note, being well prepared lets you hold your ground even against an opponent who seems full of power. It stops them from easily making offensive moves against you because they see no good opening.
It's about creating such a solid, secure base through preparedness, positioning, discipline, that the enemy looks at you and just sees no exploitable weaknesses, no easy angle of attack.
Right, and only once you are utterly secure, then you patiently wait. Wait for the enemy to make a mistake, to reveal a vulnerability, to overextend.
Then Chapter 5, Energy, introduces this dynamic interplay between Cheng and Qi.
Yes, the orthodox or direct force, Cheng, and the unorthodox or indirect force, Qi. The real power, Sun Tzu argues, comes not from using just one or the other, but from their skillful combination. That's what creates overwhelming power and surprise.
Okay, break that down a bit. The Cheng is the expected move.
Kind of. Think of the Cheng force as what's obvious, what fixes the enemy's attention. Maybe it's your main body of troops facing them directly. It looks like the main threat.
But the real strategic energy, the Cheng, comes from the Qi.
Often, yes. The Qi is the unexpected maneuver. The flanking movement, the ambush, the feigned retreat that lures them in, the sudden appearance where you were least expected. It strikes at a point the enemy hasn't prepared for because their attention is locked onto the Qing.
And Sun Tzu, again, is highlighted here for developing the idea of the strategic reserve.
He is. He advised commanders facing a strong enemy to divide their forces maybe into three groups. One engages frontally, acting as the Qing, fixing the enemy. The others are held back as reserves or deployed for indirect actions, the Qi, ready to exploit opportunities or strike unexpectedly when the moment is right.
And the goal isn't just to attack with this combination, but also to force the enemy to divide their forces.
That's a key part of it. If they react strongly to your Qing by committing their main strength, then your Qi force finds a weak point elsewhere. If they try to cover all possible angles to guard against your Qi, they inevitably spread themselves thin.
Making them vulnerable to a concentrated attack on one of their now weaker segments.
Exactly. That pattern, concentrating your strength against the enemy's forced dispersion, is something Sun Tzu constantly seeks to create.
Discipline must be absolutely critical for this kind of complex maneuvering.
Oh, essential. A well-disciplined army acts like a single, unified body. The sources mention that in such an army, the brave soldier can't just impulsively charge ahead alone, nor can the cowardly soldier just break ranks and retreat alone. Everyone moves, or doesn't move, according to the overall plan.
There's that famous, maybe harsh anecdote about Wu Qi.
Right. Executing a soldier who had advanced without orders and successfully taken an enemy head, even though it was individually a success, it violated the command structure and could have disrupted the larger strategic design. It shows the extreme emphasis on maintaining that unity of action.
The sources also touch on personal traits that hinder strategy. Cowardice, for example.
Yeah, and it's defined not just as fear, but as a kind of timidity that stops you from seizing an advantage when it appears, being too quick to flee or being excessively focused on just staying alive yourself. These traits, Sun Tzu suggests, lead directly to capture.
And conversely, a skilled commander looks to exploit character flaws in the enemy commander.
Absolutely. Things like a quick temper, arrogance, overconfidence, as well as physical weaknesses like fatigue or catching them in constricted terrain, inducing fear, doubt, confusion in the enemy through manipulating appearances, feigned retreats, sudden movements. It's all part of this broader psychological game.
Which brings us to Chapter 6, Weak Points and Strong Points, or Vacuity and Substance, Shu Shi.
Yes, this really distills the manipulation of forces into a core principle. Always, always attack the enemy where they are empty, Zhu, weak, unprepared, and avoid engaging them where they are full, Shi, strong, concentrated, prepared.
And the ultimate expression of this is getting to the battlefield first.
That's a key example. If you occupy the ground and wait for the enemy, you are rested, prepared, at ease, you are full. The enemy, racing to meet you, arrives tired, potentially disordered, maybe strung out. They are empty in terms of energy and preparation.
So the commander who excels is the one who dictates the terms. They compel the enemy to move and react in ways that are disadvantageous to them.
Precisely. Rather than being compelled themselves. The sources detail specific methods for achieving this manipulation, enticing the enemy with the prospect of gain, maybe false gain, to lure them into positions you've chosen.
Or the opposite, displaying apparent danger or difficulty to deter them from moving in a direction that would be advantageous for them.
Exactly. You actively work to tire out the enemy who is rested. You make the well-fed hungry by cutting their supplies or luring them away from their food sources. You force those who are encamped and resting to get up and march. You rapidly move to positions they feel they must race to defend, and you race unexpectedly to places they simply don't anticipate you being.
And the way you achieve victory, Sun Tzu says, should be determined according to the enemy's specific posture and weaknesses at that moment.
Right. You analyze their state and exploit whatever you find. Shame the easily angered general into making a rash mistake. Relax the confident, strong opponent by appearing weak yourself, fostering their arrogance. Humiliate the proud commander. Bait the greedy one with false prospects. Use your spies constantly to gather intelligence on the suspicious or cautious leader.
It comes back to that idea of inducing the enemy to take on a recognizable, fixed form, while you remain fluid, adaptable, formless.
That's such a powerful concept. If the enemy commits their forces to a specific disposition to face what they think you're doing, they become a defined target. They have substance usually, but that substance is now fixed and potentially vulnerable.
While you, remaining formless, your true strength, your intentions hidden, can suddenly concentrate your force at a specific point of their now dispersed or committed strength.
allowing you to attack with superior numbers against just a small segment of their army. It's using your formlessness to induce their form, and then exploiting the inherent weaknesses that their chosen form creates.
This flows perfectly into the vital role of maneuver, understanding terrain, and the qualities of the commander covered in Chapter 7 through 9.
Absolutely. Chapter 7, Maneuvering, really emphasizes that gaining and maintaining positional advantage is crucial, and achieving this often relies heavily on speed and deception.
It seems to imply that direct, predictable routes, head-on clashes, are often really dangerous.
They usually are. Strategic maneuver is about using indirect routes, unexpected approaches, appearing where you're least expected, and controlling the pace and timing of the engagement.
Which connects directly to Chapter 8, Variation in Tactics. Adaptability isn't just nice to have, it's essential.
Utterly essential for survival and victory. Sun Tzu discusses the concept of the 9 situations, though it's maybe better understood not as literally 9 types of ground, but as different kinds of strategic circumstances that demand fundamentally different approaches.
He lists 5 potential dangerous faults, or variations that might not be obvious, right? Ground you shouldn't camp on, frontiers you shouldn't linger on.
Ground you shouldn't attack, ground where you can't afford to be routed, and even commands from the sovereign that shouldn't be obeyed if they contradict the immediate reality on the ground. It's about recognizing that different strategic situations require different strategic responses. Knowing when not to engage is just as important as knowing when and how to attack.
The sources give that interesting example for dealing with contentious ground terrain that's equally good for both sides, but the enemy got there first.
Right. The rule isn't attack them head on to take it. No, instead, you lure them away from it. Feign a retreat. Create confusion elsewhere. Use ambushes. Force them to react to perceived threats in another direction, making them abandon their advantageous position without a costly direct assault.
Then Chapter 9, The Army on the March, really hammers home the absolute necessity of intimately understanding the terrain you're operating in.
Intimately is the right word. Knowledge of topography, rivers, marshes, mountains, passes gained through diligent reconnaissance. Using local guides, it's vital not just for finding the enemy, but for safely deploying, supplying, and commanding your own forces.
It's about deep situational awareness,
Mm-hmm.
keenly observing the landscape and recognizing the subtle signs that might reveal the enemy's intentions based on how they're positioned or interacting with the terrain.
Exactly. Are they trying to lure you into a trap in that narrow pass? Are they positioned up high on the hills, suggesting a defensive posture? You have to read the ground and the enemy on it.
The sources list specific terrain principles too. Value high ground, sunny slopes. Disdain low, damp ground.
Right. Never climb uphill to attack an enemy holding the heights. Don't confront an enemy who has hills directly behind them. It prevents their easy retreat and gives them good observation over you. When crossing mountains, stick to the valleys for easier passage. After crossing a river, get well away from it quickly.
Why move away from the river?
To avoid being trapped with the river at your back if attacked, and also potentially to lure the enemy across after you, so you can fight them on ground you've chosen, maybe when they're vulnerable mid-crossing or just after.
That anecdote about General Pei-Shing is powerful here, moving his camp just before the flood.
It perfectly illustrates terrain intelligence beyond just fighting tactics. He moved his army's camp from a fortified position, which seemed secure, to a nearby hill, just before a huge storm caused the river to flood, completely inundating his original campsite.
So his insight saved his army not from the enemy but from nature.
Exactly. It shows that deep terrain understanding is vital for the army's safety, its sustainability, not just for positioning in battle.
And all this brings us back inevitably to the commander, who, in the Warring States period, held just immense personal authority. Their capability, their character, could literally decide the fate of the entire state.
The sources are very specific about the essential qualities this leader must possess, echoing those earlier 5 factors. Intelligence, for planning and adapting. Trustworthiness, so soldiers actually believe in the rewards and punishments. Humaneness or benevolence, showing compassion. Understanding the soldier's toil. Courage, decisiveness, seizing opportunity without wavering. And sternness, enforcing strict discipline, making sure everyone is equal under the rules.
Other traits are mentioned too, like credibility.
Yes, credibility is crucial. The general's orders have to be trusted and implemented for the army to be unified and achieve anything. And also, the knowledge of victory, which sounds a bit mystical, but probably implies a kind of intuitive decisiveness born from deep experience and insight.
The sources also give a pretty stark list of faults in a commander that reliably lead to defeat.
They do. A quick temper that leads to rash decisions. Constant infighting among the officers. Commands that just aren't implemented down the line. Insubordinate subordinates. An inability to actually employ the soldiers effectively. Having the civilian population bitter towards the army, undermining that moral law factor.
Also having an old or exhausted army, soldiers whose morale is shot because they're thinking of home or deserting, an army that's disordered, or one that's been psychologically damaged by repeated scares or defeats.
An emotional control is explicitly called out as critical. Sun Tzu warns, do not use arms because of your own emotions. Letting personal anger or embarrassment dictate strategy. That leads to inconsistency, loss of dignity, loss of trust.
So prudent, calculated use of force secures the nation. Wary, disciplined leadership keeps the army whole.
Right. The ideal general is portrayed as this master of balance, not recklessly seeking death, but not timidly obsessed with just staying alive either. They act solely based on the demands of the situation, the strategic calculus, not swayed by personal feelings, pleasure, anger, none of it.
When they see an opportunity, they strike like tigers. Otherwise, they remain quiet, defensive, inscrutable, shutting the door to the enemy.
Their action and inaction are purely matters of strategy, not emotion. And finally, the commander's job extends to selecting and training the troops properly.
You can't just have numbers, you need capability.
Exactly. The sources emphasize, commanders who fail to sort out the differing levels of skill and capability within their own forces are the ones who get beaten. Effective weapons are needed, sure, but they're useless without well-trained soldiers and generals. If they haven't practiced, haven't prepared, they will be fearful, hesitant, unable to adapt when facing the enemy.
This rigorous preparation, this deep understanding of your own forces, the enemy, the environment, it all leads us to what might be the single most critical element in Sun Tzu's whole system, the one he dedicates an entire chapter to: intelligence, espionage, and psychological warfare.
Yes. Chapter 13, the use of spies. It's remarkably focused, and the sources really highlight its significance, maybe history's first dedicated chapter just on spycraft. It underscores the absolutely crucial, non-negotiable role of intelligence for any strategic success.
Sun Tzu makes an almost moral case for prioritizing intelligence, doesn't he?
He does, a very powerful one. He points out, look, a major military operation is an immense drain on the state. It causes terrible hardship for the people. Yet victory, which could prevent all that prolonged suffering, often hinges entirely on knowing the enemy's true condition.
So to refuse to spend the relatively small amount needed for spies to gain that vital foreknowledge.
It's described as extremely inhumane. It's seen as a fundamental failure of leadership, a crime against humanity almost, because your ignorance directly leads to prolonged war, increased suffering, wasted resources, all because you were stingy about intelligence gathering.
Foreknowledge, gained through intelligence, is presented as the key. The thing that lets smart governments and wise generals overcome others and achieve extraordinary things with minimal cost.
And the sources outline the specific qualities needed in the commander who uses spies effectively. The wisdom of a sage, combined with benevolence, righteousness, subtlety, and a really sharp perception to see the substance, the real meaning, hidden within intelligence reports.
Intelligence work is inherently subtle.
Incredibly subtle and pervasive. Sun Tzu says there should be no area where spies are not employed. It has to be everywhere.
This subtlety extends even to gathering intel on specific enemy personnel.
Yes. You must use spies to learn about the enemy's defensive commander, his key assistants, his staff, his guards, even his attendants. Knowing the personalities, the loyalties, the habits, the potential weaknesses of the enemy leadership is absolutely vital information.
The risks involved sound extreme, though. The penalty for failure.
Severe. The sources note the stark warning. If a spy's mission gets exposed before they've completed it, that spy and everyone they told about the mission should all be put to death. Secrecy is absolute. There's no room for error.
The sources also differentiate between different kinds of information sources.
Right, you have your open sources, traders, diplomats, maybe persuaders or defectors who can provide visible, more easily obtained information, general knowledge.
But for the really critical stuff, the invisible information.
Like the enemy's secret plans, their true strengths and weaknesses, their hidden ambitions, the real personalities of their leaders, for that, you need closed sources. You need spies operating in secret.
And there's that particularly valuable, subtle type. The converted spy, the double agent.
Yes. This involves getting hold of an enemy spy and turning them, usually through generous bribes, promises, good treatment. You then use them to feed false information back to their original masters, or even to actively spy on their own side for you.
Sun Tzu stresses treating these converted spies very generously.
Extremely generously, because they are invaluable assets operating right inside the enemy's system. The sources mention historical figures like Tintan, Chashi, Fanshu, all succeeding through the clever use of converted spies.
Underpinning this whole chapter, and really the entire text, is that fundamental principle intelligence serves: knowing oneself and knowing the enemy.
That's the bedrock. Victory requires comprehensive understanding not just of your own side, but critically of the opponent's situation, capabilities, and intentions.
And this focus on intelligence, on understanding the enemy's mind, ties directly into the psychological side of warfare and the art of deception again.
Absolutely. The sources note something really insightful about deception. It's often most effective when it exploits the target's existing preconceptions or biases.
So it's easier to mislead someone by reinforcing what they already believe, rather than trying to persuade them of something completely new or contrary to their worldview.
Much easier. Vulnerability to misperception, whether you induce it deliberately or the enemy creates it themselves through wishful thinking or poor judgment, that vulnerability is a key target for any strategist using deception.
And psychological warfare tactics feed into this, actively trying to induce fear, doubt, confusion, indecision in the enemy commander and his troops.
Exactly. Undermine their morale, disrupt their cohesion, make them second-guess themselves.
The Sources give that striking historical example of General Li Mu fighting the Huns.
Right. He used spies effectively, gathered good intelligence, but his overall strategy was deeply deceptive. He adopted strict defense combined with feigned weakness. For years, he forbade his own troops from actually fighting or even taking captives, always retreating.
Strategically, it worked. It tired out and misled the Huns, but internally.
Internally, it had a cost. His own troops, and even his king, started to perceive him as a coward because of this constant refusal to engage. It shows how deep deception can manipulate perceptions far beyond just the intended enemy target.
There's also that modern example from the sources looking at it just for the strategic method about Hezbollah's propaganda.
Yes, targeting Israeli mothers via the internet during the 2006 war. A Hezbollah leader is quoted explicitly stating the aim was psychological, to create public pressure within Israel, influence government decisions, achieve a psychological breakthrough.
It shows the enduring relevance of using information, manipulating perceptions, beyond just the direct military fight, to achieve strategic goals.
It really does.
It's incredibly clear that these ancient principles are absolutely not confined to military history books. Let's talk about their enduring relevance, how they're applied today, often far, far beyond any battlefield.
Yeah, the sources make that very plain. The art of war's principles are now routinely applied in completely different fields. Modern business strategy, for one.
Big time.
Legal negotiation tactics, sports coaching, even, as we said, navigating complex personal relationships and conflicts. You won't find Sun Tzu writing a chapter on 5 principles for startups, obviously.
No, probably not.
But the sources clearly indicate this widespread adoption is happening. The core thinking translates.
It suggests the text offers these universally valuable takeaways, doesn't it? For understanding competition, negotiation, positioning, strategic thinking in almost any competitive arena you face in daily life.
Definitely. Those core ideas about really understanding your opponent, using indirect approaches, timing your moves, leveraging advantages, they're just timeless strategic tools.
The sources even point to modern analytical frameworks that seem influenced by this kind of strategic thinking. They mention Shulsky's 5 requirements for deception to be possible.
Right, and those analytical models like BTD and SQD.
BTD being behavior targeting deception.
Yeah, aiming to make the target do something specific you want them to do based on the false belief you create.
And SQD is status quo deception.
Right, aiming to keep the target doing what they're already doing, or more likely, failing to notice or react to what you are secretly doing, keeping them complacent while you prepare or act. These models are discussed in the sources specifically when analyzing the strategies of non-state armed groups, or NZAGs.
And the point is made that even basic tactical denial or deception can achieve strategic ends, often fitting that SQD model.
Exactly. By simply denying the target knowledge of your actions or preparations, you keep them on their current course, the status quo, which allows you to achieve your own strategic goals without them interfering. Actually, changing the target's behavior, BTD, is often much harder, much more complex.
The sources give some specific historical examples from these analyses. We should look at them impartially, focusing just on the strategic method being described.
Okay. Al-Qaeda's actions leading up to 9/11 are mentioned.
Right. The deceptive methods used fraudulent travel documents, violating immigration laws quietly, maintaining a low profile, using coded messages, though apparently some leaders prefer the operatives just act normally to avoid suspicion. These are described as relatively rudimentary denial and tactical measures.
Yet they achieved a strategic surprise of immense consequence against the U.S. It fits that SQD paradigm perfectly. The deception, however simple, allowed the attack preparations to proceed completely unnoticed and unchallenged within the existing security systems.
Another example discussed is Hezbollah's strategy between 2000 and 2006.
Yes, the sources describe them deliberately trying to blur their public image, sometimes appearing as a terror group, other times positioning themselves as a legitimate Lebanese political and social organization.
Playing both sides.
In a way. They minimized overt terror activities against Western targets during that period, conducted their more sensitive operations confidentially, often denying responsibility. The goal of this deception seems to have been maintaining a certain international status quo perception, keeping major powers off their back while they secretly built up their military capabilities.
The sources note they felt pretty confident before the 2006 war, though their attempts at casualty deception during the war were apparently less successful.
And Hezbollah is assessed in the sources as having fulfilled those key requirements for deception described by Shulsky during that build-up period. They had strategic coherence internally. They understood their target, Israel, the international community, through intelligence. They had strong internal security for their activities, and they used channels to feed certain information or deny others.
Then there's the LTTE example from Sri Lanka during the Indo-Sri Lanka Accord in 1987.
Right. The LTTE publicly appeared interested in the accord, even agreed to its terms, which included disarming.
But secretly.
Secretly, they had large caches of weapons while pretending to comply with the disarmament. And crucially, they also started working with the Sri Lankan government against the Indian peacekeeping force that the accord had brought in. And eventually, they assassinated the Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, who was closely associated with that accord.
So their strategic goals were completely counter to their public stance. They wanted dominance, they wanted to avoid being disarmed by India, retain their military power, and ultimately get India out.
And the sources highlight a major vulnerability they exploited: weak Indian intelligence. The Indians apparently had a very poor ability to actually verify if the LTTE was complying or to uncover their true intentions and ongoing covert operations. There's that intercepted LTTE message quoted, "Nobody in India knows about our operation."
They saw the accord not as peace, but as a peace trap.
Exactly. Something to navigate, to use for cover, until they felt ready to resume the war on their own terms. It was essentially an SQD strategy feigning compliance to maintain the status quo externally, buying time to rearm, reposition, and wait for their moment.
The sources even include a kind of assessment table for that LTTE arms deception, using the BTD-SQD framework.
Yeah, it's interesting. They rate it as a moderate strategic threat. While the LTTE's overall strategic coherence became flawed once the deception began because their actions contradicted their public position, they clearly understood their target, India, had the necessary internal infrastructure and security, used the available channels, though maybe didn't control the feedback loop perfectly, and importantly, benefited from weak counter-deception efforts by India.
And the conclusion was that both BTD and SQD outcomes were possible, roughly equally likely.
Right, which demonstrates how these tactical deceptions pretending to disarm were used very effectively to achieve significant strategic objectives, primarily under that SQD model of maintaining a false status quo.
Wow. When you look at Sun Tzu through the lens of these specific, detailed modern analyses, those ancient principles suddenly feel incredibly contemporary, don't they?
They really do. It's also interesting, based on the material, to just briefly contrast Sun Tzu's whole approach with some strands of Western strategic thought.
The sources mention Machiavelli, for instance.
Right, whose practical guide to power, The Prince, seems to accept basically every type of trickery as a legitimate, almost necessary tool for a ruler. It's a very straightforward, pragmatic acceptance of deception.
Sun Tzu's approach feels different, though. Deeper, maybe?
I think so. Deception isn't just presented as a standalone trick you pull out when needed. It's deeply integrated into this broader, philosophically informed framework that prioritizes minimal conflict, strategic positioning, calculation, understanding the opponent.
And those Taoist underpinnings we talked about, the focus on human nature, psychology, adaptability, fluidity, formlessness, they provide a very different flavor, a different strategic worldview. compared to maybe more rigid or perhaps more technologically focused military theories that developed elsewhere.
Definitely. The sources also briefly contrast Sun Tzu with the Confucian view, which apparently saw warfare as one of 5 formal state ceremonials, giving it a kind of ritualistic or prescribed place, whereas Sun Tzu treats it as this independent, vital field of purely pragmatic study, essential for the state's very survival.
Okay, let's round out this deep dive by looking briefly at the historical context. Sun Tzu himself, the person, and the text's authorship.
The art of war is traditionally placed, as we said, within that incredibly competitive warring states period in China, generally dated around the 3rd century BC, maybe parts are even earlier.
And the figure associated with it is Sun Wu, known as Sun Tzu, Master Sun.
Right. According to the earliest historical accounts, notably the grand historian Sima Qian, who's a key early authority and clearly believed Sun Wu was a real historical figure. Sun Wu served King Holu of the state of Wu.
And he had military successes.
He's credited with significant ones, including defeating the much larger forces of the state of Chu, apparently partly because the Chu army was famously undisciplined, which Sun Tzu exploited.
The sources also mention Sun Pin.
Yes, a very prominent strategist in his own right, active later in the Warring States period. He's traditionally considered a descendant of Sun Wu.
And he's known for strategies like those used at quailing and mulling tactics, often associated with the art of war. And he's credited with developing concepts like the strategic reserve we discussed.
Exactly. However, the sources are careful to acknowledge that there is scholarly debate surrounding the exact authorship and compilation of the text as we have it today. It's not entirely clear-cut.
There are alternative accounts, like from the Wu Yu Chunchu.
Right, which offer different, sometimes maybe more romanticized or legendary details about Sun Wu's life and his famous test involving the palace women. And some historical accounts present lineage information that seems chronologically problematic.
Like the idea that Sun Pin was Sun Wu's grandson.
Yeah, that account by Teng Mingxi conflicts with the historical dates for when each man lived and is generally dismissed by scholars.
But the crucial point the sources make is, regardless of whether the historical Sun Wu was the single author, or if the text is a compilation by him and later strategists influenced by his core ideas.
What's undeniable is that the art of war had become an incredibly important, widely studied, highly respected military text by the late Warring States period. Its principles were being tested, refined, and validated in the brutal reality of those conflicts.
So the enduring power lies in the principles themselves, which proved effective and resonated across centuries, regardless of the precise authorship details.
That seems to be the key takeaway. The ideas endured because they worked.
And the legacy and transmission of the text are significant too. It wasn't just some obscure manual.
No, it became one of the foundational works included in the famous collection known as the 7 Military Classics in China, alongside other important texts like Wuzi and Weiliaozi.
And important figures throughout Chinese history kept engaging with it, editing it, writing commentaries.
Absolutely, helping to preserve it and interpret it for new generations. Most notably, the great statesman and military figure Cao Wei Wuti from the Three Kingdoms period wrote a really foundational preface for his own edition of The Art of War. His interpretations became hugely influential.
And its journey to the West was slow.
Very slow, relatively speaking. It started with fairly late translations, like Amiot's early French version. Early English attempts by figures like Calthrop weren't widely influential. It really took off with more scholarly and accessible translations like Lionel Giles's in 1910 and Samuel Griffith's later one.
So this history of transmission shows how these profound insights, developed thousands of years ago in ancient China, gradually spread and eventually gained global recognition for their timeless strategic wisdom.
A long journey, but the ideas proved powerful enough to make it.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into the sources on Sun Tzu's The Art of War, I think the overwhelming takeaway has to be that this is just far, far more than an ancient military manual about how to fight battles.
Oh, absolutely. It's a really profound, multi-layered exploration of strategy itself, of human nature, leadership, the dynamics of conflict in the broadest possible sense.
And it consistently elevates intelligence, adaptability, deep preparation, truly understanding your opponent, and critically, achieving your objectives with the minimum cost and conflict. Ideally, as we keep saying, winning without fighting at all.
That's the gold standard he sets. Its enduring power isn't just historical trivia, it's powerfully relevant today. We see that demonstrated by its application across these incredibly diverse fields, high-stakes business competition, complex negotiations, even just understanding personal interactions better.
Whether you're looking at those ancient battles, the historical anecdotes we discussed, or analyzing the modern examples of strategic deception from the sources.
Those core ideas about knowing yourself, knowing your opponent, understanding the strategic configuration of power, and skillfully exploiting the vacuity and substance, the weaknesses and strengths of any situation you face, they remain incredibly potent tools for thinking and for acting effectively.
Which leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to carry forward. Something directly inspired by the principles we've unpacked from all these sources today. Given Sun Tzu's absolute insistence that victory comes from knowing both your enemy and yourself, and given how fundamentally he believed deception works by exploiting perception and striking at those points of vacuity, those weaknesses, how diligently are you applying these same principles?
That's a challenging question.
How well do you truly understand the empty and full points, the strategic advantages and vulnerabilities, not just in obvious conflicts or big competitions, but in the myriad of smaller challenges, negotiations, and competitive situations you encounter every single day?
It's certainly a powerful lens through which to view the world around us, a very strategic lens.